Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is Wednesday, April 2nd. Welcome back. This is episode 71. Happy to be here fresh off a trip to Palm Beach for the NFL annual meetings. It's the owners' meetings. You got Shad Khan walking around the lobby with his mustache. I had a conversation with David Tepper that I will leave privately as he sat across from me at a table while I was writing, but it was a fun trip. Had a lot of Vikings conversations. Really the last big event until the NFL draft, which is really only 3 weeks away, which is absolutely ridiculous because this offseason has been ridiculous, but really happy to be here. Going to take your questions as we usually do early in the week, even though we're in the middle of the week, because I wanted to take everything in and make sure I bring you the utmost analysis that I could. If you're new here and watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. The like button, would really appreciate that. If you're listening on Spotify, hit that follow button. It helps us out, and you can check us out on Apple, iHeart, any other spot you get your podcast. As always, this show is presented by First Resource Bank. That is a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area. Got branches all over the place. Phenomenal people running the thing. Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson. They're huge Vikings fans. They support the show. Christy at the front desk of the Washington branch will talk intricate Vikings specifics with you. So highly recommend First Resource Bank. The information for them is below in the description. Like I said, I was in Palm Beach at the owners' meetings. For those who don't know, they move this event around like every year. In 2023, it was in Arizona at the Biltmore Hotel, which was way too nice. Last year, it was at the Ritz-Carlton in Orlando. I told a story on the radio last year about how there was a point at which I was in the lobby of the Ritz. I went to the bathroom, and as I walked in, Jerry Jones was zipping his pants up. Not that it was just out in the open. So anyway, I thought I'd toss that in there. This year, it was at the Breakers in Palm Beach, which, it's down there in Florida. The weather was great, much better than it still is in Minneapolis somehow on April 2nd. And had a conversation on Monday. Gosh, I'm going through the days. Monday, we had a morning conversation the beat writers did with Kevin O'Connell, talked to Kwesi Adofo-Mensah a bit, and then Mark Wilf, one of the Vikings co-owners, spoke. And then Tuesday, Kevin O'Connell talked really early in the morning at a breakfast. The first day was very quarterback heavy. The second day was very roster draft kind of specific. So really good stuff. Nothing absolutely outside of the ordinary. I wrote a story on Monday about how the Vikings wanted to move on. Everyone up and down the roster of the brass seemed to want to move on from the Rodgers conversation. So I wrote kind of, for me, it's appropriate to move on unless they or the team or J.J. McCarthy or what have you gives us a reason to revisit it. Now, if Aaron Rodgers would just sign with the Pittsburgh Steelers, then we don't ever have to talk about this again, you wouldn't think, but he has yet to do so at the time of this recording. So it is what it is. But these questions that I take today, as we always do, are not Rodgers related, not much quarterback specific. It's more fun for me to talk about everything else at this point. Probably more fun for you guys to hear about everything else at this point. And there's a lot of draft stuff that I think is worth getting into and talking because, again, we're only 3 weeks away. So if you have not already, and there's a specific spot in this podcast that you want to skip to, it's down there, at the bottom of the video if you're watching on YouTube, and then I'll give some timestamps in the description. But we will hop right into it. I'm going to head over to Twitter where I call for questions at the early part of almost every week. And I've got them all. I've got the usernames that people have asked about, and I can't wait to get into it beginning right here. The first question comes from Nick Miller, who follows this stuff religiously. You almost wonder if Nick could he just get a job covering the Vikings every day, because he's tweeting about it all the time and asking good questions like this one. But he asked, with KOC/Flores expressing a lot of confidence in Isaiah Rodgers being an every down player, how big of a need is cornerback early in the draft? Then he also adds, with the Vikings playing three safeties so often and Blackman returning, feels like the need is exaggerated. As far as it being exaggerated, I monitor, I guess, what people ask and what they think, and I have seen a lot of the mock drafts just around the internet, and there are a lot of them. Holy heck, there are a lot of them. I've seen a lot of Jahdae Barron from Texas. I've seen some Trey Amos conversation. Max Harrison, I believe, from Kentucky has been mocked to the Vikings in certain spots. So, I guess as far as it being exaggerated, I'm not going to talk about that. I'll say to the point you make about three safeties. So and how often Brian Flores utilizes them. I did some quick math. Like, if you look last year, how often did the Vikings have Byron Murphy Jr., Shaq Griffin, and Stephon Gilmore on the field together? It was like 25% of their defensive snaps. So just not a ton. Whereas if you looked at how often were Harrison Smith, Cam Bynum, and Josh Metellus on the field together as three safeties, it was about 70% of the defensive snaps. So that's 100% a correct point from Nick, in that the Vikings utilize three safeties a ton. That is what they do. And although they lost Cam Bynum, who signed for a hefty deal with the Indianapolis Colts, I still think the strategy is going to be from Brian Flores to want to have two deep safeties with Harrison Smith and potentially Theo Jackson, maybe a draft guy, which we'll get into at some point. And then Josh Metellus will still be that rover, do everything, play some linebacker, play some slot defender, that type of strategy. And you're right, Nick, in that Kevin O'Connell was effusive in his praise on Tuesday morning in Palm Beach about Isaiah Rodgers. And I this has been something, if you've gone back and read from some of the first analysis we did at The Athletic on the Vikings signing Isaiah Rodgers, who was this guy who played sparingly last year in Philadelphia, and who really played a lot in 2022 with Indianapolis as a former sixth-round pick, before getting suspended in 2023 for gambling. The Vikings prioritized this guy in free agency. Brian Flores felt very strongly about him. I wrote this and kind of tweeted it, but it's similar in the sense that, for as much confidence as Brian Flores had in Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman, like those three guys were proven players. They started, they played considerably. So there was projection from a health standpoint and their specific fit in Brian Flores' system. There wasn't a ton of projection in terms of like the guys hadn't really done it. Whereas there was more of that with a player like Zach Bond, who ultimately signed with Philadelphia, but the Vikings were definitely interested. For him, in Zach Bond, he had a lot of opportunity. He ultimately chose Philadelphia in that regard. But I see Isaiah Rodgers more in that mold of like, this is a player who, yes, he started in the past, but more of a projection that Brian Flores feels like, regardless of his frame, which he's listed around 5'11", 170, he's competitive, he's tough, he has the speed to run. Is he going to get beat at times by physical receivers? I think it's probably the case. But to your point, Nick, in terms of the initial question, Kevin O'Connell did say he's going to be an every down player. So I definitely see him as a guy alongside Byron Murphy Jr. who's going to play a ton of snaps. And then, you look, Kevin O'Connell also highlighted Jeff Okudah as a guy who they have familiarity with from his time in Detroit and just going against him. I think the preference would be in those three cornerback looks, where they play nickel defense, and for one reason or another they decide that is the premier route to go. Jeff Okudah is more of a boundary-specific player. Alec, what the heck does that mean, the boundary? The short side of the field where he can be physical, he doesn't have to run as much. That's where they see like Jeff Okudah fitting in. And so, like, if you ask me, do I think the Vikings need more talented young corners? The answer for me would be absolutely yes. That's why they drafted Kyrie Jackson last year. That's why they drafted Mekhi Blackman a year before. And I think Mekhi, coming off the ACL, could be one of these guys. Dwight McGlothern, there is optimism about what he can be as an undrafted player. So But I still would say, yes, finding talented young corners who are difference makers would be a boon for this team. Now, do I think the draft has a ton of those types of players at number 24? I'm not sure I really do. So it's hard to find that specific fit. And then do I think the route that the Vikings are going to go is to take a cornerback in the first round? I mean, unless a player that they absolutely love falls to that point, that's not the spot that I would probably peg it as the most likely option. And that's not to say they wouldn't draft one later on if there is a player that they really like, or that they wouldn't prioritize a player in the UDFA portion that they feel that who could also fit alongside a Mekhi Blackman and Dwight McGlothern. Because I do think that they're going to be pretty active in that UDFA portion. Both they have the money to do it with their cap space, and they've also succeeded in that regard. And the relationships they have with agents make it possible, and the infrastructure that they built make it possible for those players to want to come to Minnesota. But I again, as far as talking about the need being exaggerated, I'm not sure how most people feel about it. So that would be a little probably out there for me. But I right now would say that the number one priority probably in the first round is not, it doesn't feel like cornerback would be that spot unless there is a player that they just absolutely adore that makes sense to them. It makes sense in falling to them at that point. But it's a really good question, and I hope that kind of gives a feel of how to think about it in some ways. And I'll get to throughout this podcast the positions that I feel like make maybe more sense there. And you could probably, Nick, you're as locked in as you are. You probably could have a feel for where I'd go with that. Next question comes from Gabriel, who asks a very simple question: any draft nuggets? I mean, the first nugget that I feel like it segues perfectly from Nick Miller's question to start about cornerback is, I mean, I thought some of the most interesting comments that were made publicly by Kevin O'Connell at the owners' meetings that were obviously non-quarterback related were his comments about left guard and Blake Brandel. He said, and I'm not quoting specifically, if you want the specific quote, you can go find the story in The Athletic because I talked about this subject at length. But he said, Kevin O'Connell said, if the season were to start today, and he was talking as of Tuesday, April 1st, and it was not an April Fool's joke, I promise you. I didn't even realize it was April Fool's because of how much mayhem those trips tend to be. But he said if the season were to start today, Blake Brandel would probably be in position to be the player at left guard. And he talked about Blake and how in 2024 they wanted to give him the full year at one position to really kind of focus in and see what he can be. And Kevin O'Connell talked about early in the year, alongside Christian Darrisaw and Garrett Bradbury, they felt pretty good about some of the reps and some of the showing of Blake Brandel. And I think externally, a lot of us would have probably agreed. Now, you could go look at Pro Football Focus grades, or you could analyze the intricacies of every rep in the tape. And I'm sure there were instances both in the run blocking area and in pass protection where you're like, it's just not. It's not an elite, but again, that was never the expectation, and they didn't pay Blake Brandel to be an elite left guard. And then down the stretch, obviously Christian Darrisaw goes down, tears ACL against the Rams. In the back half of the season, it was a little more shaky, and Kevin O'Connell essentially was like, look, he's helping out Cam Robinson from a communication aspect. It's also obvious that Cam Robinson is not he doesn't cover for the player next to him the way that a Christian Darrisaw would. So Kevin O'Connell said you kind of have to give Blake some grace for the back half of the season. Now, having said all of that, and for as positive as he was about Blake, I thought it was relevant that he said if the season were to start today, well, the season does not start, as you guys very well know, until the fall. And what happens between now and the fall? The NFL draft, which presents an opportunity to add competition to the interior of the offensive line, and specifically for that left guard position. And so if you were to ask me right now, coming off the question that Gabriel says, any draft nuggets, I mean, the nugget that I would say is, if I were pegging it right now, what is the likeliest position? Let's say they stay at 24. What is the likeliest position that they would probably select? I think it would probably be that interior of the offensive line spot. Now you ask, Alec, are they just trying to fill a short-term need? My answer to that would be no. I think there are multiple paths to where if you draft an interior player on the offensive line who has position flexibility, it could do a couple things for you. First, like the Vikings love Brian O'Neill, and he's been spectacular, and I love covering him. He is as honest, as, open, as emotional, as big of a captain, as important for the locker room as you can possibly find. But he is really has this year on his contract, and then probably there's conversations to be had after this year about what does the future look like from a contract perspective. He's going to near that 30-year-old kind of marker. What does that mean? Again, for as much of a presence as he is for this team and this locker room, and as positive of a presence he is, it's going to be, it will be damn hard to move on from him if that would be the route that they go. And I don't want it to make it seem like at all right now that I think that's possible, because it's hard for me to envision that. But I think if push were to come to shove and his representatives want a certain amount and that wouldn't work, and then you have a player who could play on the interior for 2025, but then potentially slide out to right tackle in the future, that would be one avenue where it makes sense for the present and future. The other aspect would be, let's say you take a player who could play guard in 2025 and then slide in at center in the future. I mean, Ryan Kelly is 32 years old. You'd absolutely love, you get 2 phenomenal years out of him where he plays 34 games plus into January and into the playoffs. But I think you got to be mindful of the injury history and what things could look like. So to get a guy who could play left guard in 2025 and then slide in at center in the future, that's another possibility to where that position, to me, that's just why I'd peg it probably right now as the favorite if they were to stay. Now, if they trade back from 24, and we're going to get into that at some point in this podcast, then you start to ask questions of, is there a guard that makes sense later in the first round or early in the second round? Like, how does that really work? And I think those are very valid questions to ask and to talk about. The other draft nugget, Gabriel, that I think I'd provide is, they have done work, no question, on receivers in this draft at all levels. And I'll just say, like, if Keenan McCardell, the receivers coach, and Kevin O'Connell, who is very in tune to what makes a receiver successful, which was evident in the Jordan Addison selection, if these guys are evaluating receivers, like, you really trust the work that they do. And if they feel like there is a player that makes sense, I at least externally, and probably you guys as fan, feel similarly, that you trust kind of their evaluation at that position. And so I know they've done work there. I would be pretty surprised if they got through the extent of this entire draft and did not come away with a receiver. I also don't know if that means that I would expect it to happen in the first round. Like, I got a lot of questions for this mailbag of who makes sense in the first round, if it's a skill player, if it's a receiver. And while that stuff is fun, and I do think beyond fun, there are reasons to support why it would make sense to do that. I just don't know if that's the most likely route at this point. But I would say the second draft nugget, besides left guard, for Gabriel, who asked the question, any draft nuggets, would be if they emerge from this draft without a receiver, I would be it would be interesting. It would be worth, like, questions of how much did you consider it, what have you. But I think there are enough receivers who can separate kind of later on the draft that would be interesting enough. So that's what I'd say as far as draft nuggets. And I do expect to write a story at The Athletic later this week with some specific names and prospects that I hope you guys go check out. So that hopefully kind of answers your question a little bit. All right, next from Skull Doc, who is always trusty and good for a good question in the mailbag, asks, Alec, did you get a sense if they're targeting a specific position with their first pick? We've kind of gone through this thus far. Like I said, if I had to peg it right now, the interior of the offensive line makes the most sense, specifically for that left guard kind of spot. But I'd say The way I think about it more, and it's not as sexy of an answer. It's probably a little bit of a cop out of an answer, but it's the way that I think is the right way to think about this is like what positions would be useful for the Vikings right now? I'd ask that question to you guys as you're listening, and you probably could come up with some like snap answers off the top of your head. Well, what about safety? Are we sure about Theo Jackson? What does the future hold for Harrison Smith? Well, I'd say anytime you're doubting that Harrison Smith can continue to do this in the future, probably wrong from any of us. But like safety, I think tight end is an interesting one. They still have not added a TE3 kind of behind TJ Hockenson, Josh Oliver. TJ Hawkinson's contract, it really makes it tough to move off until like 2027. So I'd be pretty surprised if, that's just like if they really swung big early there. I mean, I think like, again, to the question of what positions would be useful, cornerback remains one. I mean, interior defensive line, especially if it's early and there's a guy that falls, that makes sense. It's pretty unavoidable to talk about that still as a possibility. But I'd pair that question, what positions would be useful for the Vikings, with like, where is this draft deep in specific positions? So like, let's just take interior the defensive line for one. Like, I wrote about this probably around the combine, but the most successful interior defensive linemen in the NFL are typically drafted pretty high. You get your outliers, your Nnamdi Metabike's, a guy like that, but most of them, I mean, like you go down the list of the Dexter Lawrence, the Jeffrey Simmons, the Daron Paynes, the list is what it is. A lot of those guys were taken pretty high in the first round, but this draft is pretty deep at interior defensive linemen. So if, let's say, the Vikings love a specific prospect at the top of the first round and he's gone by the time they're picking at number 24. Okay. And then there's an interior offensive lineman available at 24 or in the back of the first round. So they go interior offensive lineman early, but they know the draft is deep at interior defensive lineman. So they think they can come back there in the third round with the player they like. Like, that to me is the way I would think about it. Is like, what positions would be useful for the team? And then where is it deep? Like, I'll answer a question later about safety and about Emmanwori, who's like the combine winner of the draft. 10 RAS score, which is an athletic rating that kind of dictates athleticism and explosiveness. And he's, oh my gosh, he was amazing, had an amazing vertical leap. But like, I think you dive into the tape and I've said this on the podcast before, I'm not an elite safety evaluation mind, but I can watch when a guy processes quickly, gets to the ball quickly. And for as great of an athlete as a guy like he is, which again, I'm going to get to in more depth later, like, does that position with that type of prospect really make sense at that spot? I'm not really sure. So, I mean, the positions for me, that's why interior of the offensive line, you need left guard now. You might need center right tackle in the future. Could you get some like flexibility? That's where I go. I mean, I like safety. You think about Theo Jackson, you think about Harrison Smith's future. That's another spot. I mean, again, defensive tackle, I don't think you can ever have enough. And only having Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave, really guaranteed for 2 seasons, like that's a spot that's kind of unavoidable as well. But that's kind of how I think about it in terms of positions they target. It's more, what positions would be useful for this team now and into the future, and where is the draft thick to be able to find those players? I think framing it that way is how you get to the best place of how this draft could go for Minnesota. Next question comes from Chooch, which is a great name. I think I can say that on the podcast. I really hope. Don't want to get in trouble for that. But is a trade down with real value a true option? It feels like not many teams would need to trade up with the depth at picks 15 to 40. It's an interesting point. Like, as you talk to people within the league, you hear a lot of, there's some blue chip prospects. They call them blue players. So like the elite of the elite. There's some blue players, probably less than 10 even. And then it's a gap from like picks 10 to 50, 60, some will even say 70 of just like starter caliber players. So the point and the question that Chooch is kind of asking is, why would a team trade up to 24 to draft a player that's starter caliber? And there's not that many, differences between like the players you could maybe get at 24 versus the player you could get at 40. It's a very good question. I think where you would be able to trade down, I think would be if there's a prospect, and let's just start with a non-quarterback prospect that a team loves that would want to come up for. So let's just say, for example, like the Philadelphia Eagles are at 32, and an interior defensive lineman like Kenneth Grant from Michigan is on the board at 24. And the Vikings are like, we're not in love with the idea of a 340-pound nose tackle type player at this point. So we don't really, but we could get some value. We only have 4 picks, and the Eagles are like, we love Kenneth Grant. So they're like, we would trade from 32 to 24, and the Vikings could move down and recoup draft capital and still make a selection of a starter caliber player. Like, I think that's one way in which the trade down makes sense. I think the other avenue, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, is like if there is a quarterback that a team that did not take one at the very top of the draft likes, who is there at 24, who a team wants to get the fifth year option, which is very valuable for a lot of positions, but definitely for quarterback. They're like, you know what? We would trade up from 33, from 34 to go get our quarterback and get that 5th year option, and that would make sense. I mean, again, this is where you wade into the conversations of, is there a quarterback that is that a team likes enough that is available at 24? Like, who would be that type of player? I think the obvious answer would be like Jackson Dart from Ole Miss. Could Jackson Dart go higher than 24? I definitely think that's possible in this draft. You hear certain things, but let's say Cleveland at number 2. They're like, yeah, I don't know about Shador at number 2, so we'll take Abdul Carter. But they still want a quarterback later in the draft. So then, and let's say the Giants, they're like, I don't know about Shador, so we'll take Travis Hunter or what have you, and then try to get Jackson Dart later in the first round. I think that's where the trade down really could also make sense. And now, if the Vikings were to do that and the Giants offer, let's say, the Cleveland offers 33 and 67 or 33, 94 and 104 for the Vikings number 24 pick, the Vikings would then have to weigh, what is the value that makes sense? Are we okay not having the 5th year option of a player? And those are very real questions that they would have to consider. But like, if you're the Vikings and you think you can get interior offensive lineman that you really like it at 33, let's just throw out a name, Donovan Jackson from Ohio State. And you can also get pick number, 94 and 104. So you can potentially get a safety that you really like, an interior defensive lineman that you also really think has upside. And you could do that while also getting him an interior offensive lineman. I think you have to consider that. And then again, it becomes a question of how much do you value the 5th year option? What are the trade offers that a team like Cleveland that has 10 picks would be willing to trade? What would a team like New York kind of be willing to part with? I mean, the other question is, let's say Jackson Dart, or the other topic to consider is, let's say Jackson Dart is gone by 24. Is there another quarterback in the first round that a team would want to trade up for? Like, is Tyler Shuck from Louisville that player? That's kind of hard to see. Is Jalen Milroe from Alabama that guy? Like, I'm an Alabama guy. I'm from there. I've watched Jalen Milroe. He's as talented of a runner as there is. And like, you can't teach that level of skill set, but is there really a team that thinks he could become the commander of the offense, the passer that makes sense at 24? It's kind of hard to see as well. So, I mean, these are the conversations that I think they're going to have internally and that are worth having externally, because I do think if the Vikings can, I mean, they would love, of course, to have more than 4 picks. That's pretty obvious. Now, then there were ways to have more than 4 picks. That's a conversation for another time. But they also aren't going to just trade back to do it. They want value. I mean, Kevin O'Connell is pretty clear. Like, if you're drafting high, you need a player who is going to come in and produce. So they see that, they get that. And I've been on the record on the podcast and on the radio when I talk with Paul Allen and in writing of, like, you can't just trade back at this point to create darts to throw that are 30% hits. Like, you have to hit. And I get it's an uncertain process, but that's just where this team is. Next question comes from Ben in MN, which is a nice little tag right there. Any sense of a contract extension for Kwesi Adofo-Mensah? So Mark Wilf, one of the Vikings co-owners, obviously spoke with us in this beautiful little courtyard on Monday afternoon, and he talked for 15 minutes. And the Kwesi Adofo-Mensah extension subject was one of the primary ones in that conversation. He was very upfront. He said, yes, we want to get a deal done with Kwesi. He was asked about whether kind of decision-making, the hierarchy could change as a byproduct of the extension. He said no in that answer. So for me, the question becomes, like, what is the structure of the extension? What is the length? What is the money? Like, the Vikings and Mark Wilf made it pretty clear. They want to extend Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. And the question is, do they want to extend them at the same length that they did Kevin O'Connell? What does the money look like? Do they want to extend them for a shorter term to assess a year or two more of drafts to really make a decision, or of decision making to make a decision? I think that's where, like, I've been pretty open for a while of I think Kevin O'Connell just had more leverage, both with the job that he did and how he's perceived. But, like, I'll also say this because I feel pretty strongly about it. Like, I think the way that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah thinks about team building and about roster construction, like, I think that stuff is very beneficial and additive to an organization. Now, the job is a lot of different things. It is gathering consensus. It is being a front-facing leader. It's a lot of that stuff. It is hitting in the draft, which I've been very forward in saying they have not done at the clip that you have to do to sustain winning at a very high level in the NFL. So it's an interesting conversation. It's interesting in that, I mean, he's approaching the draft without an extension, but I also don't think Kwesi is a guy who operates like with I mean, it's easy to say on the outside, but I really think, like, he's a guy who operates with the organization's best interest. I don't think he has the I don't think he's going to let not having the extension consume him the way that maybe others would. So yeah, I we'll see kind of on a timeline, but it was Mark Wilf, one of the Vikings co-owners, made it pretty clear that they want to get it done. It's just, for me, it's a question of money, of length, and all of that. Question from Minnesota North Star. Non-Rodgers question, thank goodness. How confident are they in the depth behind Ryan Kelly at center, considering his injury history? Are the Vikings that confident in Michael Juergens, who they took in the 7th round last year, especially if Kelly goes down early in the season for a long time? I think it's a great question. And I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I mean, really, for me, this 2025 year is probably going to rise and fall with two different aspects. The primary one is quarterback play. J.J. McCarthy, the hope would be that he has a phenomenal spring, a phenomenal summer, a great training camp, and can just help this team get to where it wants to go in his first year as an NFL starter. And then the other aspect that this season, to me, rise and fall is it's just health, durability. Like, this roster on paper, it's really impressive, and it would make you have pretty high expectations. But I mean, the team's going to have to be durable for them to reach kind of those heights. And so I think one of the most important positions of the durability with a quarterback that is as young as J.J. McCarthy is center. I mean, one of the most positive characteristics and traits that Ryan Kelly brings to the table is his command, his communication, his understanding of what defenses are presenting, his ability to keep the quarterback calm and at bay. And so if you remove that, and now you have a guy in Michael Juergens who's never played that spot, I mean, that's a tough place to be. Now, could Blake Brandel potentially slide in at center? I think he could. But again, the drop off there is enough to provide cause for concern. And I have a lot of optimism, and I know the Vikings do, in Tyler Williams, who's the director of health and performance, to keep these guys and put these guys in the best positions to stay healthy for as long and as good of a situation as possible. But it's the NFL, it's physicality, injuries happen, and the Vikings have been pretty fortunate over the last few years in terms of staying healthy. So it's a great question. I think that's where, again, if you draft interior offensive lineman who has that center versatility, that's another route that could maybe give your floor, just raise your floor a little more, knowing kind of Ryan Kelly's past. Excuse me. Carl, who's always in here asking questions. He's from Lake Elmo. Is there any concern with some of the new free agents who had recent injuries, and that they wouldn't be ready by training camp? It sounds like the only player who would be a little iffy is Rondale Moore, the receiver that they signed kind of late in the free agency period. He suffered a non-contact knee injury last fall in the joint practices that the Falcons had with the Miami Dolphins. And I mean, we'll see in terms of the next few months, anything can pop up. Like, I'll just say, having covered the league now for multiple seasons, like, typically you show up to OTAs and there's some player that you didn't expect that's working on the side field because something came up, whether it's soft tissue or what have you. So we'll see. But right now it sounds positive in that Kevin O'Connell, the only player he mentioned at the owners' meetings that's questionable regarding training camp, the beginning of training camp, would be Rondale Moore. Next question comes from Eric Hansen, another loyal listener and reader who I really appreciate. What's your honest feel for Colston Loveland at number 24, or Emeka Egbuka / Luther Burden, given how much the Vikings would like to have two tight ends on the field, and Addison's future and what that might look like? I mean, this has been a popular subject that I've seen on social media of the Vikings should take a receiver in the first round because it makes sense. A, if Jordan Addison misses some games. B, Jordan Addison only has a couple more years. I mean, the Vikings are going to have to decide in terms of fifth-year option. I mean, they could, and he could sign an extension. All that's obviously very possible. And so I get the conversation. I also know that number 3 receivers right now are costing at a pretty high clip. I think Dyami Brown, which I just absolutely botched his name. I think he generated like $10 million in the free agent market. So, I mean, it's a very valuable spot. I think what I would first say is that the Vikings have a lot of faith in Jalen Nailor after he was healthy for an entire season and he got to learn what it is like to play off of Justin Jefferson, and that he's a reliable player. Like, truth be told, if Jalen Nailor was a free agent this past offseason, I think he would have made a pretty good amount of money. So it's definitely a big year for him. Colston Loveland is interesting because he played at Michigan, and he's a pass-catching tight end who's dynamic, has familiarity with J.J. McCarthy. I think they're pretty close. But it's just hard for me to envision that making sense where you'd have him, TJ Hawk. Now, if TJ Hawkinson, if they didn't have TJ as a pass catching tight end that they really appreciate and like, I mean, I think it's more of a conversation, and I still do think they want to add a tight end 3. This is a pretty good tight end draft, so it's intriguing. If it were to be Loveland at 24, unless they have like 13 personnel packages with one receiver, 3 tight ends, or they want 2 receiving tight ends with Hawkinson and Loveland, it's just hard for me to envision that. And I like other guys too, like Elijah Arroyo from Miami. I really like that guy. I just don't know. I'd say if you asked me who is the skill player that I would support at 24, like, it probably would be Egbuka because of his just route savvy ability and just he was at Ohio State. He played with Jeremiah Smith. He played with a ton of guys. He didn't have to be the guy, and he was still incredibly productive. And I think part of the challenge with this is, like, even if Jordan Addison misses X amount of games, I mean, Justin Jefferson's as great of a team player as he is, and he's as good as you're going to find for that little receiver. Like, he wants to get his certain amount of targets, and then Jordan Addison's going to expect his amount of targets. And then if you draft a player, a receiver in the first round who is used to being the guy, I mean, there's only one football, which is a cliche that is said a million times, but I really think that affects chemistry, dynamics, and all of that. And I think if there would be a player that would kind of be okay and understanding, Ibuka might be that guy. He also is thick enough to probably insert in the run game and play a role there. I mean, Luther Burden, for those who don't know, he's a Missouri receiver. I went to Mizzou, so I followed this guy's entire arc. With the ball in his hands, there might have not been a more talented player in college football. He's just as dynamic, hard to tackle, hard to bring down, as electric as you can find. I didn't always think he was the greatest route runner. I also didn't feel like he ran off the line of scrimmage as much as you would like a guy at that level to prove that they are as committed as they are on a down-to-down basis. So, like, if you were to add a Luther Burden, now you've got all these jet sweeps, gadgets you could do that would be like, it's I get it. I could understand it. But I think there are questions with him that are worth asking, even if, again, with the ball in his hands, he's as dynamic as they come. JT Thomas asked the question, and I think I just answered it essentially, but you have to take a skill player in the first round. Who would you take that is projected to be around the 24th spot? Like, the Vikings don't need a running back at this point desperately. I've been pretty open and clear that I think Omarion Hampton from North Carolina is an absolute stud, but I don't know if he'd be there at 24. And again, I don't really know how that fits. Igbuka would probably be my selection because of his route running savvy, his ability to be okay being kind of that third option, his versatility. I just think he's a smart and capable player, so he'd probably be my answer. And then I'll end it with Brian Boston, who asked the question that I teased earlier of thoughts on Nick Emmanwori. So for those who don't know, he's a South Carolina safety who's, I want to say 6'3", 220 pounds. When you see the guy on the field and you turn on the tape, and I have because I'm insane, it's an impressive body type. Like, it is. You just don't see guys who look like that, who are as, like, as sculpted as he is. That's just the case. Brian says he's got a 10 RAS, which I mentioned earlier. It's an athletic kind of explosiveness metric that I do value, and I think the Vikings, like, they have similar models to rate this type stuff. But he says 10 RAS and plays solid to back it up. But does he fit in the Flores secondary makeup right now? I feel like he might be more of a Metellus role. We are already set with the Harrison Smith, Bynum deep safety roles. Like, I think that's a pretty solid statement from you, Brian. The film for me, and again, I'm not going to pretend to be a draft expert, an evaluation expert, but I just don't see that size, that speed translate to just this impossibly productive instinctual player that I think Brian Flores would value. Now, ultimately, it could happen, and we would see how that plays out. And he's rated highly on almost every draft of, analysts, top 50 big board, top 30. I mean, you've seen him mocked as early as like 13 to the Dolphins. That's just a lot for me. And I think there are some more savvy safeties later on that would make more sense in terms of they may not be the flashiest, they may not be the 10 on the RAS score, but can they play ball? Can they get guys lined up? Are they smart with high IQs on the field? Can they understand the complexity of Brian Flores' defense? Are they aware enough to make checks on the fly? Like, that's where Brian Flores' defense just differs from others, where I get it. If you put Nick Emmanwori in the box and you got that big, incredible-looking guy, I get why people would think that's a fit, and I'm sure Brian Flores would maximize him because he can do that with a lot of different players, especially in the secondary. But it's just hard for me to think that would be the preferred option. And again, with where Harrison Smith is and kind of Theo Jackson, though I am very high on him, not having done it at a consistent basis, I think finding a guy who could play the deep half, who could get guys lined up, who could fill down in the box, that's probably more of the safety role that would make sense to me. So that'll do it for the questions. That's about 45 straight off the cuff for you guys. Appreciate you being here. Episode 71 of the Alec Lewis Show, presented by First Resource Bank. If you made it this far, like I always say, please hit that subscribe button on YouTube. It helps us out. If you're listening on Spotify, hit the follow, Apple, iHeart, everything else that you can do, we'd appreciate. But might be back later this week with another show. Gonna have a bunch of the draft analysts that I trust and respect over the next few weeks. So a lot of draft stuff coming. Any other questions that you had that you didn't get to lob in, throw them in the comment section on YouTube or hit me on Twitter. I'll be as responsive as I can. Enjoy the week. We got to get some warm weather. I mean, look, Minnesota is phenomenal. I've loved living here. I thought Kevin O'Connell was very accurate in his comment about the Twin Cities being an underrated food destination. I completely agree. I'm very upfront and forward that there are some spots in this town that I love getting food at. But with the weather, I mean, we're April 2nd right here. We got to get some sun behind me, and we will soon. Thank you guys for listening to episode 71 of the Alec Lewis Show.